The autumn mist clung to Burke County like a burial shroud, thick and suffocating as it rolled across the Georgia swamplands. In 1851, this remote corner of the state remained largely untouched by the industrial progress sweeping through the north, where time seemed to move as slowly as the brackish water that surrounded the Rooke family estate. Silas Rooke stood at the edge of his property, watching his 6-year-old son Thomas chase fireflies through the dying grass. The boy's laughter echoed across the barren fields, a sound that should have brought joy, but instead filled Silas with a dread so profound it made his chest ache. The child had no idea what legacy awaited him, what terrible burden would soon rest upon his small shoulders. "Papa, look!" Thomas called out, cupping his hands around a captured firefly. "It's like holding a star." Silas forced a smile, though his weathered face struggled with the expression. At 34, he looked far older, his dark hair already streaked with premature grey, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights spent wrestling with an impossible choice. The weight of generations pressed down upon him like stones in a grave. "Come inside, son," Silas called, his voice carrying across the twilight air. "Your mother has supper waiting." As they walked toward the imposing 2-story farmhouse, its white paint peeling like diseased skin, Silas couldn't help but notice how the very land seemed to recoil from their presence. No birds nested in the ancient oaks that surrounded their home. No insects buzzed in the stagnant pools that dotted their property. Even the Spanish moss hung motionless, as if afraid to sway in the evening breeze. Inside, Martha Rooke moved about the kitchen with practiced efficiency, her movements sharp and precise. She had been beautiful once, Silas remembered, with golden hair that caught the sunlight and eyes blue as a summer sky. Now, at 28, she appeared gaunt and hollow-eyed, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. The Rooke curse had aged her as surely as it had aged him. "Wash your hands, Thomas," she instructed without looking up from the cast-iron pot she stirred. Her voice carried the flat tone of someone who had learned to speak without feeling, to exist without truly living. The boy obeyed, climbing onto a wooden stool to reach the wash basin. As he scrubbed his small hands, Silas caught Martha's eye across the kitchen. In that brief glance, he saw his own torment reflected back at him. They both knew what was coming. They both understood the choice that loomed before them like a gallows. Dinner passed in relative silence, broken only by Thomas's innocent chatter about his day exploring the property. He spoke of finding interesting rocks by the creek, of watching a hawk circle overhead, of the strange dreams he'd been having about a man in black who visited him while he slept. Silas's fork clattered against his plate. "What did you say about dreams, son?" Thomas looked up, his young face earnest and untroubled. "The man in black, Papa. He comes to see me sometimes when I'm sleeping. He tells me stories about our family, about great-great-grandfather Ezekiel, and the special book he keeps safe for us." Martha's face went white as fresh snow. Silas felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. The boy was only 6 years old, far too young for the gospel to be calling to him. According to family tradition, the book remained dormant until the heir reached his 16th birthday. Something was changing. Something was wrong. What? "What does this man tell you about the book, Thomas?" Silas asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "He says it's very important," Thomas replied, taking another bite of cornbread. "He says it keeps our family safe and makes sure we always have enough to eat. He says one day I'll get to help take care of it, just like you do, Papa." After dinner, when Thomas had been tucked into bed with a story and a kiss goodnight, Silas and Martha sat in their small parlor, the weight of unspoken fears heavy between them. The fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows on the walls, and every flicker seemed to take the shape of accusing fingers. "It's starting early," Martha whispered, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. "The gospel is calling to him already. Why now? He's just a baby, Silas." He's just a little boy. Silas stared into the flames, remembering his own childhood visits from the man in black, the way the stranger's words had seemed to burrow into his mind like parasites. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we can't ignore what's happening. The equinox is only 3 weeks away." "There has to be another way," Martha said, though her voice lacked conviction. "There has to be something we can do, some way to break this curse." "You know there isn't," Silas replied, his voice heavy with resignation. "My father tried. His father tried. Every generation has tried to find another way, and every generation has failed. The gospel demands what it demands." Martha stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over their blighted land. "Then we run. We take Thomas and we leave this place. We go west to California, somewhere the gospel can't follow." You think others haven't tried that?" Silas asked, rising to join her at the window. "My uncle Jacob tried to run when I was Thomas's age. They found his body 3 states away, drained of every drop of blood, with pages from the gospel carved into his flesh. Outside, the mist continued to roll across their property, and in its depths, Silas could swear he saw shapes moving. Tall, dark figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. The watchers were already gathering, drawn by the approaching deadline, like vultures to carrion. "The new pastor in town," Martha said suddenly. "Pastor Elizabeth Whitmore. She's been asking questions about our family, about the strange happenings in the area. Maybe she could help. Maybe she knows something about breaking curses." Silas shook his head. "No outsiders, Martha. You know the rules. The gospel doesn't tolerate interference." "But what if she's different? What if God sent her here to help us?" "God?" Silas laughed bitterly. "If God cared about the Rooke family, do you think we'd be in this situation?" "No, Martha. We're on our own, just as we've always been." As if summoned by their conversation, a sound drifted through the house, the soft whisper of pages turning, though no one was reading. The sound came from below, from the chapel beneath their home, where the gospel rested in its iron coffin. The book was stirring, sensing the approach of its feeding time. Martha grabbed Silas's arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. "Promise me," she whispered urgently. "Promise me you'll try to find another way. Promise me you won't give up our son without a fight." Silas looked into his wife's desperate eyes and saw his own soul reflected there, broken, haunted, but still clinging to a thread of hope. "I promise," he said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. "I'll try to find another way." But even as he spoke the words, the sound of turning pages grew louder, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled 13 times, an impossibility, since no church in Burke County had a bell that could ring more than 12. The gospel was waking up, and it was hungry. Pastor Elizabeth Whitmore arrived in Burke County on a Tuesday morning, when the fog hung so thick that the sun appeared as nothing more than a pale smudge in the grey sky. She drove her modest wagon down the rutted dirt road that served as the main thoroughfare, her belongings secured beneath a canvas tarp that had seen better days. At 29, she was younger than most expected a pastor to be, and certainly younger than anyone expected a female pastor to be in rural Georgia. The Methodist Church had sent her to this remote corner of the state with specific instructions: establish a congregation, tend to the spiritual needs of the scattered farming families, and investigate the disturbing reports that had been filtering back to the regional headquarters. Reports of unexplained illnesses, mysterious disappearances, and a general atmosphere of fear that seemed to permeate the entire area. Elizabeth had accepted the assignment eagerly, driven by a calling that burned in her chest like a holy fire. She had grown up in Boston, the daughter of a prominent minister, and had felt God's hand upon her life from an early age. Despite the obstacles placed before women in the clergy, she had persevered, earning her theological education through private tutoring and demonstrating her worthiness through years of missionary work among the poor and downtrodden. The town of Waynesboro, the county seat, was larger than she had expected, but still small enough that her arrival caused quite a stir. As she guided her wagon down the main street, she noticed how conversations stopped and curtains twitched as residents peered out at the newcomer. The looks she received ranged from curious to suspicious to openly hostile. She stopped first at the general store, a weathered building with a hand-painted sign that read Morrison's Mercantile. The proprietor, a heavy-set man with graying whiskers, looked up from his ledger as she entered, his expression shifting from welcoming to puzzled as he took in her clerical collar and traveling clothes. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Pastor Whitmore," Elizabeth corrected gently, extending her hand. "Elizabeth Whitmore. I'm the new Methodist minister assigned to this area." The man's eyebrows shot up toward his receding hairline. "Pastor? You're Oh, that is to say, you're a woman, yes," Elizabeth finished with a patient smile. "I understand it may be unusual for this area, but I assure you I'm fully ordained and qualified to serve this community's spiritual needs." The storekeeper, Morrison, she assumed, shook her hand with obvious reluctance. "Well, I suppose. That is, if the church sent you. I'm Samuel Morrison. Welcome to Waynesboro, Pastor." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I was hoping you could direct me to suitable lodging while I establish myself here. I'll also need to find a location for services until a proper church can be built." Morrison scratched his whiskers thoughtfully. "Well, there's Mrs. Henderson's boarding house on Elm Street. She's a God-fearing woman, runs a clean establishment. As for services..." He paused, glancing around the store as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Might I ask what brought you to Burke County specifically? We're not exactly on the main roads, if you catch my meaning." Elizabeth had prepared for this question. The Methodist Conference received reports of spiritual need in this area. Families without regular worship, children growing up without proper religious instruction. I volunteered to come and see what could be done. "Reports," Morrison repeated slowly. "What kind of reports?" "Nothing specific," Elizabeth replied, though this wasn't entirely true. "Simply that the people here might benefit from regular ministry." Morrison's expression grew troubled. "Pastor Whitmore, I don't mean to speak out of turn, but you might want to be careful about which families you visit. Some folks around here, well, they keep to themselves for good reason." "What do you mean?" The storekeeper glanced toward the window, then leaned closer and lowered his voice. "The Rooke family, for instance. They live out on the old plantation road past the swamp. Been there for generations, but they don't come to town much. And when they do..." He shuddered. "There's something not right about that family, Pastor. Something unholy." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine, though she couldn't say why. "Unholy in what way?" "Sickness follows them wherever they go," Morrison whispered. "Crops fail in their wake. Animals won't go near their property. And the children, Lord help us, the children in that family never seem to live long enough to have children of their own." "That sounds like superstition, Mr. Morrison. Perhaps what this family needs is pastoral care, not fear and isolation." Morrison straightened, his expression closing off. "You do what you think best, Pastor. But don't say I didn't warn you." Elizabeth spent the rest of the day settling into Mrs. Henderson's boarding house and exploring the town. Waynesboro was typical of rural southern communities, a collection of modest homes, a few businesses, and a courthouse that served as the center of civic life. What struck her as unusual was the atmosphere of barely concealed tension that seemed to permeate everything. People spoke in hushed tones when they thought she wasn't listening. Conversations stopped abruptly when she approached. Children were called inside when she walked past their homes. It was as if the entire community was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. That evening, as she sat in her small room at the boarding house, Elizabeth opened her journal and began to write. October 3rd, 1851. Arrived in Waynesboro today. The town is smaller than expected, but seems prosperous enough. The people are guarded. There's an undercurrent of fear here that I can't quite identify. Mr. Morrison at the general store warned me about a family called the Rookes, claiming they're somehow cursed or dangerous. I suspect this is merely rural superstition, but it may explain some of the spiritual malaise I've been sent to address. I plan to begin visiting families tomorrow, starting with those closest to town and working my way outward. If the Rooke family is truly as isolated and troubled as Mr. Morrison suggests, they may be in particular need of pastoral care. Lord, grant me wisdom and courage as I begin this ministry. Help me to be a light in whatever darkness has settled over this place. She closed the journal and prepared for bed, but sleep was slow in coming. Outside her window, she could hear the distant sound of night birds calling across the swamplands, their cries echoing like lost souls searching for redemption. The next morning dawned grey and humid, with a thick mist that seemed reluctant to lift. Elizabeth began her pastoral visits with the families closest to town, introducing herself and gauging their interest in regular worship services. The response was mixed. Some welcomed her warmly, others remained politely distant, and a few made it clear that they had no use for a female minister. By afternoon, she had worked her way to the outskirts of town, where the houses grew more scattered and the roads more treacherous. It was here that she first heard the name Rooke spoken with something approaching terror. "You stay away from that road," warned Mrs. Abernathy, a widow who lived alone with her 3 cats. "Nothing good ever came from the Rooke place. My late husband used to say you could smell the evil on them when the wind was right." Evil is a strong word, Mrs. Abernathy. Perhaps they're simply in need of Christian fellowship. The old woman's eyes widened. "Pastor, you don't understand. That family, they're not like other folks. They've got something dark in their blood, something that goes back generations. People who get too close to them have a way of disappearing." Disappearing? Or worse, Mrs. Abernathy whispered, found dead in ways that don't make sense, drained of blood, or torn apart by something that ain't no natural animal. The sheriff don't investigate anymore. Says it's just the swamp claiming its due, but we all know better. Elizabeth left Mrs. Abernathy's house with more questions than answers. As she drove her wagon back toward town, she found herself turning onto the old plantation road almost without conscious thought. The path was overgrown and barely passable, winding through stands of cypress and oak, draped with Spanish moss that hung like funeral shrouds. The deeper she went into the swamp, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew thick and still, and an unnatural silence settled over the landscape. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even her horse seemed nervous, snorting and tossing its head as if sensing some invisible threat. After nearly an hour of difficult travel, she crested a small rise and saw the Rooke property spread out before her. The sight took her breath away, though not in a pleasant way. The farmhouse stood like a monument to decay, its white paint peeling and stained with what looked like rust or dried blood. The surrounding fields were barren despite the fertile soil, and the few outbuildings appeared to be slowly sinking into the marshy ground. But what struck her most forcefully was the chapel, a small stone building that seemed to crouch beside the main house like a predator waiting to pounce. As she approached the house, a man emerged from the front door. He was tall and lean, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that held depths of sorrow she had rarely seen. This, she realized, must be Silas Rooke. "You're lost," he said without preamble, his voice carrying across the yard with surprising clarity. "Not lost," Elizabeth replied, climbing down from her wagon. "I'm Pastor Elizabeth Whitmore, the new Methodist minister in Waynesboro. I've come to introduce myself to the families in the area." Silas's expression didn't change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or fear. "We don't need a pastor here. Everyone needs spiritual guidance, Mr. Rooke. May I speak with you and your family for a few minutes?" "No," he said flatly. "You need to leave, now." But even as he spoke, Elizabeth heard the sound of a child's laughter from somewhere behind the house. A moment later, a small boy appeared around the corner, chasing what appeared to be a butterfly. When he saw Elizabeth, he stopped and stared with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Thomas!" Silas called sharply. "Come inside." The boy, Thomas, looked between his father and the stranger, then walked over to Elizabeth with the fearless confidence of a 6-year-old. "Are you the lady pastor?" he asked. "The man in black said you might come visit us." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. "The man in black? Thomas, inside, now!" Silas's voice carried a note of panic that made Elizabeth's pastoral instincts flare to life. "Papa, she seems nice," Thomas protested. "And the man in black said, 'I don't care what he said,'" Silas snapped, then immediately looked stricken by his own harshness. He knelt down and took his son's shoulders gently. "I'm sorry, son, but you need to go inside now. Your mother is waiting for you." As Thomas reluctantly obeyed, Elizabeth stepped closer to Silas. "Mr. Rooke, I can see that you're troubled. Whatever burden you're carrying, you don't have to bear it alone. Sometimes talking to someone outside the family can help." Silas looked at her for a long moment, and she saw a war being fought behind his eyes, hope battling against despair, faith struggling with resignation. For a moment she thought he might accept her offer. Then the chapel bell began to toll. The sound was wrong, too deep, too resonant, carrying harmonics that seemed to vibrate in her bones. Silas went white as a sheet, and from inside the house came the sound of a woman crying out in fear. "You have to go," Silas said urgently. "Right now." "Don't come back here, Pastor. For your own sake, don't ever come back." But as Elizabeth climbed back onto her wagon, she knew she would return. Whatever was happening to the Rooke family, whatever darkness had settled over this place, she had been called here for a reason, and she would not abandon them to face it alone. The chapel bell continued to toll as she drove away, counting out 13 strikes that echoed across the swampland like a death knell. 3 days after Pastor Whitmore's visit, the Rooke household existed in a state of barely controlled terror. The chapel bell had tolled 13 times every evening since her departure, and each night brought fresh horrors that tested the family's sanity. Thomas had begun sleepwalking, found each morning standing before the locked door that led to the chapel beneath their home, his small hands pressed against the wood as if trying to push through. When awakened, he spoke of dreams where the man in black showed him beautiful pictures in a book made of skin, pictures that moved and whispered secrets about his family's glorious purpose. Martha had stopped eating altogether, surviving on nothing but water and the occasional sip of weak tea. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her hands shook constantly as if she were perpetually cold. She spent her days sitting by Thomas's side, watching him with the desperate intensity of a mother trying to memorize her child's face before losing him forever. Silas found no rest in sleep, for when he closed his eyes, he was transported back to his own 16th birthday, when his father had led him down the stone steps to the chapel and shown him the Gospel of Bones for the first time. He remembered the weight of the book in his hands, the way the human skin binding had felt warm to the touch, almost alive. He remembered the moment when his father had taken the ceremonial knife and opened a vein in Silas's wrist, letting his blood drip onto the yellowed pages while speaking words in a language that predated Christ. The ritual had been completed just as the autumn equinox reached its peak, and Silas had felt something fundamental change within him. The gospel had accepted him as its new guardian, and with that acceptance came knowledge. Terrible, wonderful knowledge about the true nature of reality, about the things that moved in the spaces between worlds, about the price that must be paid to keep certain hungers satisfied. Now, 18 years later, that same ritual awaited his son. On the 4th morning after the pastor's visit, Silas made a decision that would have horrified his ancestors. He would seek help from the outside world, consequences be damned. He found Pastor Whitmore at the boarding house, sitting in the small parlor with a cup of coffee and a well-worn Bible. She looked up as he entered, and he saw no surprise in her eyes, only a calm acceptance, as if she had been expecting him. "Mr. Rooke," she said quietly, "please, sit down." Silas remained standing, his hat clutched in his hands like a shield. "I need to ask you something, Pastor. Do you believe in evil? Real evil, not just the absence of good, but something active and hungry and ancient?" Elizabeth set down her coffee cup and studied his face. "I believe in the reality of spiritual warfare, yes. I believe there are forces in this world that seek to corrupt and destroy God's creation. And do you believe such forces can be bound, controlled, made to serve? I believe that any attempt to bargain with evil ultimately leads to damnation," Elizabeth replied carefully. "Why do you ask?" Silas began to pace, his agitation growing with each step. "My family has a tradition, a responsibility that goes back 5 generations. We are the guardians of something that should not exist, something that demands a price for its continued containment." "What kind of price?" Silas stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "Blood. The blood of the firstborn son, given willingly on his 16th birthday. In exchange, the thing we guard remains dormant, and our family prospers." Elizabeth felt her breath catch in her throat. "Mr. Rooke, are you telling me that your family practices human sacrifice?" "Not sacrifice," Silas said quickly. "The boy doesn't die. Not immediately. The ritual changes him, makes him part of the gospel's power. He lives, but he's no longer entirely human. And when his time comes to father children, the cycle begins again." "The gospel?" "The gospel of bones, a book written in blood on pages of human skin, bound with the flesh of martyrs. It contains knowledge, terrible knowledge about the true nature of God and the things that existed before him." Elizabeth stood slowly, her mind reeling. "Mr. Rooke, what you're describing sounds like blasphemy of the highest order. This gospel you speak of, it's not of God. It's an abomination." "I know that," Silas exploded, then immediately lowered his voice, glancing around the empty parlor. "Do you think I don't know what we've become? Do you think I don't lie awake at night, praying for forgiveness for sins I haven't even committed yet? Then why continue? Why not destroy this book and break the cycle?" Silas laughed bitterly. "Destroy it? Pastor, men have tried. My great-grandfather tried to burn it in 1798. The fire wouldn't take. My grandfather tried to bury it in consecrated ground in 1820. It was back in the chapel the next morning, and 3 families in the county died of a wasting disease that same week. There must be another way. There is no other way." Silas's voice cracked with desperation. "Don't you understand? The gospel isn't just a book. It's alive, it thinks, it plans, and it's patient in ways that human minds can't comprehend. Every attempt to defy it has only made it stronger." Elizabeth moved closer to him, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Rooke, Silas, I understand that you're frightened, but what you're describing is exactly the kind of spiritual bondage that Christ came to break. No curse is stronger than God's love." "Then where was God when my father bled into that book?" Silas demanded. "Where was he when I felt my soul being torn apart and remade? Where is he now, when my 6-year-old son dreams of a demon who promises him power beyond imagination?" "God is here," Elizabeth said simply. "He's in your love for your son. He's in your desperate desire to find another way. He's in the fact that you came to me instead of simply accepting what you see as inevitable." Silas stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something she hadn't expected in his eyes. Hope. Fragile, desperate hope, but hope nonetheless. "The equinox is in 2 weeks, he said quietly. "If we're going to do something, it has to be soon. After that," he shuddered, "after that, the gospel will take what it wants, whether we cooperate or not." Deal, then we have 2 weeks to find a solution, Elizabeth said, with more confidence than she felt. Tell me everything, Silas, every detail about this gospel, about the rituals, about your family's history with it. If we're going to fight this thing, we need to understand exactly what we're up against. For the next 3 hours, Silas told her everything. He spoke of his ancestor, Ezekiel Rooke, who had first encountered the mysterious stranger in 1801. The man had appeared at their door during a terrible drought, offering salvation for the family and prosperity for their land in exchange for a simple service. They would guard his most precious possession, a book of immense spiritual power. Ezekiel, desperate to save his failing farm and starving family, had agreed. The stranger had led him to the small chapel on their property and shown him a hidden chamber beneath the altar. There, in an iron coffin lined with salt and silver, lay the Gospel of Bones. The stranger told my ancestor that the book contained the true word of God, Silas explained. Not the sanitized version found in the Bible, but the raw, unfiltered truth about creation and the price of knowledge. He said that those who guarded it faithfully would be rewarded beyond measure. And the blood ritual? That came later. The book began to communicate with Ezekiel. It showed him visions of power, of wealth, of a future where the Rooke family would be among the most influential in Georgia. But it demanded proof of loyalty. It wanted to taste the blood of each generation, to bind them to its purpose. Elizabeth felt sick to her stomach. And your family has been performing this ritual for 50 years. Every generation. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, and now, Silas's voice broke. Now it wants Thomas, but he's only 6 years old. You said the ritual happens at 16. It did until now. Something has changed. The gospel is impatient. It's been calling to Thomas since he was 4, showing him visions, preparing him. I think it knows that I'm having doubts, that I might try to break the cycle. It wants to claim him before I can interfere. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she had heard. Finally, she looked up at Silas, with determination burning in her eyes. I want to see it, she said. This gospel of bones. I want to see what we're fighting. Silas went pale. Pastor, you don't understand. The book doesn't just show itself to anyone. It chooses who can see it and those it doesn't choose. He shuddered. There are things worse than death. I'm not afraid, Elizabeth said, though her voice trembled slightly. If God has called me to help your family, then he will protect me. And if you're wrong, Elizabeth stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grey afternoon sky. Then at least I'll die trying to save an innocent child from damnation. That evening, as the sun set behind the cypress trees, Silas led Pastor Elizabeth Whitmore down the old plantation road toward the Rooke family chapel. Neither of them spoke during the journey, both lost in their own thoughts and prayers. As they approached the house, Martha appeared on the front porch, her face a mask of terror and resignation. Silas, what have you done? She whispered. What I should have done years ago, he replied. I've brought help. From somewhere inside the house came the sound of a child singing, Thomas's voice, sweet and innocent, carrying a melody that neither adult recognized. The words were in a language that predated English, predated Latin, predated any tongue spoken by human lips. The gospel was calling to its chosen heir, and the autumn equinox was only 13 days away. The chapel beneath the Rooke house was older than the building above it, carved from native stone by hands that had learned their craft in the old country. As Silas led Pastor Whitmore down the narrow stone steps, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air grew thick with the scent of old incense and something else, something organic and unpleasant that Elizabeth couldn't quite identify. The chapel was built first, Silas explained, his voice echoing off the stone walls. My ancestor Ezekiel constructed the house around it to hide it from prying eyes. What we're about to see, Pastor, I need you to understand that once you've looked upon the gospel, there's no going back. It will know you, it will remember you. Elizabeth's hand tightened on the small silver cross she wore around her neck. I understand the risk, Silas. But I can't help your family if I don't understand what we're fighting. At the bottom of the steps, they stood before a heavy wooden door bound with iron. Strange symbols were carved into the wood, not Christian crosses or familiar religious iconography, but twisted shapes that seemed to hurt the eyes when looked at directly. Silas produced an ornate key from his pocket, its metal black with age. The key has been passed down through 5 generations, he said. It's made from iron taken from a meteorite that fell in 1799, 2 years before the stranger arrived. Ezekiel claimed the stranger told him exactly where to find it. The lock turned with surprising ease, and the door swung open to reveal a small chamber lit by candles that burned with an unnatural blue flame. The walls were lined with shelves containing various artifacts, bones carved with symbols, bottles filled with dark liquids, and books bound in materials that Elizabeth preferred not to examine too closely. But it was the altar at the center of the room that drew her attention. Made from a single block of black stone, it was covered with intricate carvings that seemed to move in the flickering candlelight. And upon the altar, within an iron coffin lined with salt and silver, lay the Gospel of Bones. Elizabeth had expected something obviously evil, something that would immediately repel her Christian sensibilities. Instead, the book was beautiful in a terrible way. The binding appeared to be made from pale leather that had been worked to an almost silk-like smoothness. The pages, visible through the slightly open cover, were a rich cream color that seemed to glow with their own inner light. "It's smaller than I expected," she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Size isn't everything," Silas replied grimly. The stranger told Ezekiel that this book contains more knowledge than all the libraries of Europe combined. As they approached the altar, Elizabeth began to feel a strange sensation, a pulling, as if something were trying to draw her forward. The cross around her neck grew warm against her skin, and she found herself whispering a prayer under her breath. "It knows you're here," Silas said quietly. "It's curious about you. Can you read it? The Gospel? Pieces of it. The language changes depending on who's looking at it. Sometimes it's in English, sometimes Latin, sometimes in tongues that were old when Rome was young. But there are certain passages that remain constant, written in the blood of the covenant." Elizabeth steeled herself and stepped closer to the altar. As she did, the book's cover fell open, revealing pages covered with text that seemed to writhe and shift before her eyes. At first, the words appeared to be in Latin, then Greek, then something that looked almost like Hebrew, but wasn't quite right. Then suddenly the text stabilized into clear English, and Elizabeth found herself reading words that made her blood run cold. "And the Lord God said unto the serpent, Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle, and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shalt thou go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. But the serpent laughed, for he knew that dust was but another name for the flesh of men, and in eating dust he would consume the very children of Adam." "That's not from Genesis," Elizabeth whispered. "No," Silas agreed. "It's from the Gospel's version of Genesis. According to this book, the Bible we know is a sanitized version of the truth, edited by men who couldn't bear to face the reality of God's true nature." Elizabeth forced herself to read more, though every instinct screamed at her to look away. "And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. But the serpent whispered unto God, saying, Why destroy what can be made to serve? Why waste what can be harvested? And God listened. For the serpent's words were sweet as honey and sharp as a blade. "This is blasphemy," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking. "This book is trying to rewrite the very foundation of Christian faith." "Keep reading," Silas urged. "You need to see the covenant." Elizabeth turned the page, and the text shifted again, this time into what appeared to be a legal document written in flowing script. "Let it be known that on this day, in the year of our Lord 1801, a covenant is struck between the guardian of the gospel and the keeper of the flame. The guardian shall provide sanctuary for the sacred text, and in return the keeper shall grant prosperity to the guardian's line. But prosperity demands sacrifice, and sacrifice demands blood. Let the firstborn of each generation offer his essence to the gospel, that the covenant may be renewed and the power maintained." "The keeper of the flame," Elizabeth said. "That's the stranger who came to your ancestor?" "We think so. But we've never been sure exactly what he was. Man, demon, angel. The gospel never makes it clear." As Elizabeth continued to read, she became aware of a presence in the chamber, something watching her from the shadows beyond the candlelight. The sensation was so strong that she turned around, expecting to see someone standing behind them. But the chamber was empty, except for herself and Silas. "You feel it too," Silas said. "The Watchers, they're always here, making sure the covenant is honored." Elizabeth turned back to the gospel, and this time the text had changed to something that made her heart race with terror. "The pastor comes with fire in her heart and steel in her soul, thinking to break what cannot be broken. But the gospel sees all, knows all, and what it knows it keeps. She will serve as all must serve, or she will feed the hunger that dwells between the words." "It's writing about me," Elizabeth gasped. "Right now, as I'm reading it." "The gospel exists outside of time," Silas explained. "It knew you would come here long before you were born. It's been preparing for this moment." Elizabeth slammed the book shut, but immediately it fell open again, this time to a page covered with illustrations that moved like living things. She saw herself standing in the chapel, but in the drawing, her eyes were black as coal, and her mouth was open in a scream that had no sound. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "Now." But as they turned toward the door, they found their path blocked by a figure that hadn't been there moments before. Tall and gaunt, dressed in black clothes that seemed to absorb the candlelight, the stranger stood with his hands clasped behind his back and a smile that revealed teeth like broken glass. "Pastor Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying the whisper of autumn leaves and the promise of winter's cold. "How good of you to finally join us. I've been so looking forward to our conversation." Elizabeth's hand went to her cross, and the stranger's smile widened. "Silver and faith," he mused. "Such quaint protections. Tell me, Pastor, do you really believe that the God who drowned the world in Noah's time, who commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son, who allowed his own child to be tortured to death on a cross, do you really believe such a God would be troubled by a little book?" "I believe in the God of love and redemption," Elizabeth said, though her voice shook. "Not the twisted version presented in your gospel." "My gospel?" the stranger laughed, a sound like breaking bones. "Oh, my dear pastor, you misunderstand. This is not my gospel. This is God's gospel, the true one, the one he wrote before he decided that humanity needed comforting lies instead of terrible truths." "You're lying." "Am I? Then explain to me why the Rooke family has prospered for 50 years while their neighbors struggled. Explain why their crops never fail, why their livestock never sicken, why they always have exactly what they need when they need it." Elizabeth looked at Silas, who had gone pale as death. "Is that true?" "We've never wanted for anything," Silas admitted reluctantly. "Even during the worst droughts, our wells never ran dry. Even during the hardest winters, we always had enough food. The gospel, it provides." "At what cost?" Elizabeth demanded. "At the cost of truth," the stranger replied. The Rooke family knows what God really is, not the loving father of Christian mythology, but the cosmic force that created and destroys without sentiment or mercy. They serve that truth, and in return, they are protected. And the blood ritual? The sacrifice of children? Sacrifice? The stranger seemed genuinely puzzled. Who spoke of sacrifice? The ritual doesn't kill the child, Pastor. It elevates him. It makes him part of something greater than mere humanity. Then where are they? Elizabeth challenged. Where are all these elevated children? Where is Silas's father, his grandfather? For the first time, the stranger's composure slipped slightly. They serve in other capacities now. The gospel has many needs, many purposes. They're dead, Elizabeth said with sudden certainty. The ritual kills them, doesn't it? Maybe not immediately, but eventually. That's why the family line continues through new children, because the old ones don't survive long enough to have families of their own. The stranger's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. You understand nothing, Pastor. The boys who undergo the ritual are transformed, yes. They become something more than human, something eternal. Death is merely a transition for them. Show me, Elizabeth demanded. If they're eternal, if they're still serving the gospel, then show me one of them. The stranger was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Elizabeth heard something that chilled her to the bone. The sound of a child singing, drifting down from the house above. Thomas's voice, sweet and innocent, carrying that same alien melody they had heard earlier. The boy calls, the stranger said finally. The equinox approaches, and he is eager to fulfill his destiny. Perhaps it would be better if you witnessed the ritual yourself, Pastor. Then you would understand the glory that awaits him. Never, Elizabeth said firmly. I won't let you harm that child. Harm him? The stranger laughed again. My dear Pastor, I'm not going to harm him. You are. Before Elizabeth could ask what he meant, the stranger gestured toward the gospel, and the book's pages began to turn of their own accord. The candlelight flickered and dimmed, and in the growing darkness, Elizabeth saw images forming on the pages. Images of herself, standing in this very chamber, holding a knife above a small figure that could only be Thomas. The gospel has seen your future, Pastor, the stranger whispered. It knows what you will choose when the moment comes. It knows that when faced with the choice between the boy's life and the lives of everyone in Burke County, you will make the practical decision. What are you talking about? The gospel's hunger grows stronger each year, the stranger explained. If it is not fed willingly, it will take what it needs by force. Every person in this county, every man, woman, and child will wither and die to satisfy its appetite. But one willing sacrifice, one child given freely, will sustain it for another generation. Elizabeth felt the world spinning around her. You're lying. God would never demand such a choice. God demands many things, Pastor. He demanded that Abraham raise the knife above Isaac. He demanded that Jephthah sacrifice his daughter. He demanded that his own son die in agony for the sins of others. What makes you think he would hesitate to demand one small boy to save thousands? The images on the Gospel's pages grew clearer, more detailed. Elizabeth saw herself weeping as she held the ceremonial knife, saw Thomas looking up at her with trust and love, saw the moment when she would have to choose between individual mercy and collective survival. No, she whispered, I won't do it. There has to be another way. There is no other way, the stranger said gently. There never was. The gospel has been patient, but its patience is not infinite. The boy will be claimed, Pastor. The only question is whether his death will save others or whether it will be the first of many. As if summoned by their conversation, footsteps echoed on the stone stairs, and Martha Rooke appeared in the doorway, her face streaked with tears. In her arms, she carried Thomas, who appeared to be sleepwalking, his eyes open but unfocused. He won't wake up, Martha sobbed. He just keeps singing that song and walking toward the chapel. I can't stop him, Silas. I can't wake him up. Bow! The stranger smiled with genuine warmth as he looked at the sleeping child. The time has come, he said softly. The gospel calls and the air answers. How beautiful it is when the natural order is observed. Thomas stirred in his mother's arms, his eyes opening to reveal pupils that reflected the candlelight like mirrors. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that no 6-year-old throat should have been able to produce. The book wants to show me the pretty pictures, he said dreamily. The man in black says I'm special, that I'm going to help keep everyone safe. Elizabeth looked at the child, then at his parents, then at the gospel lying open on its altar. The weight of an impossible choice settled on her shoulders like a lead cloak. The autumn equinox was only 9 days away. The next week passed in a blur of desperate research and mounting dread. Pastor Elizabeth Whitmore had moved into the Rooke house, ostensibly to provide spiritual comfort to the family, but in reality, to study the Gospel of Bones and search for some way to break the covenant that bound them. She had sent urgent letters to theological scholars in Atlanta and Charleston, describing the situation in carefully coded language and begging for any information about similar curses or supernatural compacts. The responses, when they came, were uniformly discouraging. Most dismissed her inquiries as folklore or superstition. Those few who took her seriously offered only prayers and platitudes. Meanwhile, Thomas's condition continued to deteriorate. The boy spent most of his time in a trance-like state, speaking in languages that predated recorded history and drawing pictures that showed scenes from the Gospel's twisted version of biblical events. His drawings were far too sophisticated for a 6-year-old, rendered with an artistic skill that seemed to flow from some external source. Martha had stopped sleeping entirely, sitting vigil beside her son's bed and weeping silently as she watched him slip further away from them. Silas threw himself into physical labor, chopping wood and repairing fences with manic intensity, as if he could somehow work his way out of their supernatural predicament. Elizabeth spent her days in the chapel, poring over the gospel and trying to understand its true nature. The book seemed to enjoy her attention, revealing new passages and illustrations each time she opened it. Some of the text appeared to be genuine religious doctrine, albeit twisted beyond recognition. Other sections read like scientific treatises on subjects that wouldn't be discovered for decades. Atomic theory, evolutionary biology, quantum mechanics, all presented through the lens of theological interpretation. But it was the historical sections that proved most disturbing. The Gospel contained detailed accounts of every major catastrophe in human history, from the fall of Rome to the Black Death, all presented as necessary corrections to humanity's spiritual development. According to the book, these disasters weren't random events or divine punishments, but carefully orchestrated lessons designed to teach mankind its proper place in the cosmic order. It's not just a book, Elizabeth realized on the 7th day before the equinox. It's a record, a chronicle of humanity's relationship with something else. She was speaking to Silas, who sat across from her in the chapel, his face haggard with exhaustion and despair. "What do you mean?" "Look at this passage," Elizabeth said, pointing to a section written in what appeared to be medieval Latin. It describes the plague that swept through Europe in the 14th century, but it doesn't present it as a natural disaster or even as divine punishment. It describes it as a harvest, a culling of the human population to maintain some kind of cosmic balance. Silas leaned forward to read the text, though his Latin was limited. "Are you saying the gospel caused the Black Death?" "I'm saying the gospel claims responsibility for it, and for dozens of other catastrophes throughout history, famines, wars, plagues, natural disasters, all of them described as necessary interventions to prevent humanity from growing too numerous or too powerful." "But that's impossible. The gospel has been in my family's possession for 50 years. It couldn't have influenced events that happened centuries ago." Elizabeth turned to another section of the book, this one written in English, that seemed to shift and change as she read it. Time doesn't work the same way for this thing, Silas. It exists outside our normal understanding of causality. It can influence past events just as easily as future ones. Then we're fighting something that's already won, Silas said despairingly. If it can change the past, if it can orchestrate events across centuries, what hope do we have? There's always hope, Elizabeth said, though her voice lacked conviction. God's power is greater than any earthly force, no matter how ancient or cunning. Is it? Silas challenged. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your God has been losing this war for a very long time. Before Elizabeth could respond, they heard footsteps on the stairs above. Martha appeared in the doorway, her face white with terror. He's gone, she whispered. Thomas is gone. They found the boy in the family cemetery, a small plot behind the house where 5 generations of Rookes lay buried. Thomas stood before the newest grave, that of Silas's father, who had died 3 years earlier under circumstances that the family never discussed in detail. The child was perfectly still, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer or incantation. Thomas, Silas called softly, approaching his son with the caution one might use with a wild animal. Son, what are you doing out here? The boy's eyes opened, revealing pupils that had turned completely black. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. Grandfather is teaching me, Thomas said calmly. He's showing me what it means to serve the gospel. He says it doesn't hurt, Papa. He says it's like going to sleep and waking up somewhere beautiful. Elizabeth felt her blood turn to ice. Thomas, your grandfather is dead. He can't teach you anything. The boy turned to look at her, and she saw something ancient and terrible looking out through his innocent features. Death is just another word for transformation, Pastor. Grandfather isn't gone. None of them are gone. They're all here, waiting for me to join them. As if summoned by his words, the air around the cemetery began to shimmer and distort. Elizabeth caught glimpses of figures standing among the headstones, tall, gaunt shapes that might once have been human, but had been changed by their service to the gospel. She recognized the facial features of the Rooke family line in their twisted visages, saw the resemblance between these spectral guardians and the man who stood beside her. My father, Silas whispered, staring at one of the figures. My grandfather. They're all here. They're not your family anymore, Elizabeth said urgently. Whatever the gospel did to them, it stripped away their humanity. They're servants now, nothing more. Servants of truth, Thomas corrected, his child's voice carrying impossible authority. Servants of the real God, not the pretender that your churches worship. Elizabeth knelt down in front of the boy, taking his small hands in hers. Thomas, listen to me. I know this seems wonderful and magical, but it's not real. The gospel is lying to you, just like it lied to your father and grandfather. The gospel doesn't lie, Thomas said with absolute certainty. It shows things as they really are. Would you like to see, Pastor? Would you like to know what God really thinks of his creation? Before Elizabeth could respond, the world around her shifted and changed. She found herself standing not in the cemetery, but in a vast cosmic void filled with swirling galaxies and dying stars. And there, at the center of it all, was a presence so vast and terrible that, por favor, continue girando a sua resposta. Terror, her mind could barely comprehend it. It was God, but not the loving Father of Christian doctrine. This was the God of the Old Testament, taken to its logical extreme. A cosmic force of such immense power and indifference that human suffering was less than insignificant. She watched in horror as civilizations rose and fell at his whim, as entire species were created and destroyed for purposes beyond mortal understanding. This is what the gospel shows. Thomas's voice echoed through the void. This is the truth that your churches hide behind pretty stories and comforting lies. God doesn't love us, Pastor. We're just experiments, tests, And when we fail to meet his expectations, he starts over. Elizabeth found herself back in the cemetery, gasping and shaking. The vision had lasted only seconds, but it felt like she had witnessed eons of cosmic horror. "That's not God," she said desperately. "That's something else, something that wants us to despair." "Is it?" Thomas asked innocently. "Then explain the flood. Explain the plagues of Egypt. Explain why God commanded the Israelites to slaughter entire cities, including the children and animals." Was that love, Pastor? Elizabeth had no answer. The questions that had plagued theologians for centuries seemed to crystallize in this moment, presented by a 6-year-old boy whose soul was being devoured by an ancient evil. "The equinox is tomorrow night," Silas said quietly. "If we're going to do something, it has to be now." Elizabeth looked around the cemetery, at the spectral figures of the Rooke ancestors, at the gospel's influence spreading like a cancer through this family. An idea began to form in her mind, desperate, probably suicidal, but perhaps their only chance. "The covenant," she said suddenly. "It requires a willing sacrifice, doesn't it? The firstborn son has to choose to serve the gospel." "Yes," Silas confirmed. "The ritual only works if the heir accepts his role freely." "Then we don't let him choose," Elizabeth said. "We take away his ability to consent." "What do you mean?" Elizabeth turned to face them both, her expression grim with determination. "If Thomas can't make the choice, if he's not mentally competent to enter into the covenant, then the ritual fails. The gospel loses its hold on your family." "But how do we—" Silas began, then stopped as he understood what she was suggesting. "No, absolutely not. It's the only way," Elizabeth insisted. "If we can't save his soul, we can at least save his life." "You're talking about destroying his mind," Martha said, having approached during their conversation. "You're talking about making our son into a mindless shell." "Better a living shell than a dead servant of evil," Elizabeth replied, "and it might not be permanent. Once the gospel's influence is broken, he might recover." "Might," Silas repeated bitterly. "You're asking us to gamble our son's sanity on a might." "I'm asking you to choose between his sanity and his soul," Elizabeth said bluntly, "because tomorrow night the gospel will claim both." They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the impossible choice settling over them like a shroud. Around them, the spectral ancestors of the Rooke family watched and waited, their hollow eyes reflecting the dying light of the setting sun. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice once again that of a normal 6-year-old boy. "Papa? Mama? Why are you all so sad? The man in black says tomorrow is going to be the most wonderful day of my life." Elizabeth closed her eyes and began to pray, though she was no longer certain which God she was praying to. The day of the autumn equinox dawned grey and cold, with a mist that clung to the swamplands like the breath of the dead. Elizabeth had spent the night in prayer and preparation, gathering what few resources she had for the desperate gambit she planned to attempt. In her small traveling bag, she carried a vial of holy water blessed by the Archbishop of Charleston, a silver crucifix that had belonged to her grandfather, and a small bottle of laudanum she had obtained from the town doctor under the pretense of treating her own sleeplessness. The laudanum was the key to her plan. If she could render Thomas unconscious before the ritual began, if she could make it impossible for him to give his consent to the gospel's demands, then perhaps the covenant could be broken. It was a desperate measure, one that might save the boy's life at the cost of his mind, but it was the only option she could see. Silas and Martha had agreed to the plan with the reluctance of parents facing an impossible choice. They would drug their son's evening meal, rendering him unconscious before the stranger could claim him. It was a betrayal of everything they had been taught about the gospel's requirements, but their love for Thomas outweighed their fear of supernatural retribution. As the day progressed, the atmosphere in the Rooke house grew increasingly oppressive. The temperature dropped steadily despite the lack of wind, and shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. Thomas spent most of the day in his room, drawing pictures that showed scenes of cosmic horror beyond anything a child should have been able to imagine. "He's drawing the ritual," Martha observed, looking over her son's shoulder at a particularly disturbing image. "Look, there's the chapel and there's the altar, and that figure there, that's him, isn't it? That's Thomas." In the drawing, a small figure lay upon the stone altar while robed figures gathered around him. Above them all, a massive eye watched from the darkness, its gaze filled with ancient hunger. The detail was extraordinary, far beyond anything a 6-year-old should have been capable of producing. "The gospel is showing him what to expect," Elizabeth said grimly. "It's preparing him for tonight." "Will our plan work?" Silas asked quietly. "If we drug him, if he can't participate willingly, will that really break the covenant?" "I don't know," Elizabeth admitted. "But it's the only chance we have. The alternative is to let the gospel claim him completely." As evening approached, Martha prepared Thomas's favorite meal: fried chicken with mashed potatoes and green beans from their garden. Into the mashed potatoes, she mixed the laudanum, her hands shaking as she stirred the colorless liquid into the white mound. It was enough to render a grown man unconscious. For a 6-year-old, it should ensure deep sleep for hours. "Thomas," she called, her voice artificially cheerful, "supper's ready, sweetheart." The boy appeared in the kitchen doorway, but something was different about him. His movements were too fluid, too graceful for a child his age. His eyes held depths that spoke of knowledge no innocent mind should possess. "I'm not hungry, Mama," he said politely. "The man in black says I shouldn't eat before the ceremony. It might interfere with the transformation." Martha's heart sank. "But you love fried chicken. I made it special just for you." "I know, and I appreciate it," Thomas replied with the formal courtesy of an adult. "But tonight is too important to risk any complications. The gospel has waited 50 years for this moment. We mustn't disappoint it." Elizabeth stepped forward, forcing a smile. "Thomas, your mother worked very hard on this meal. Surely one bite wouldn't hurt." The boy turned to look at her, and she saw something flicker behind his eyes, a moment of uncertainty, perhaps even fear. "The man in black says you're going to try to stop the ceremony, Pastor. He says you don't understand how important this is. I understand that you're just a little boy who should be playing with toys, not worrying about ancient books and supernatural ceremonies." Elizabeth replied gently, "What if we postpone the ritual for a few years? What if we waited until you were older and could make a more informed decision?" Thomas shook his head sadly. "It doesn't work that way. The gospel chooses its own timing. If I refuse tonight, if I try to delay, then everyone in Burke County will suffer. The book will take what it needs by force, and many people will die." "That's what the stranger told you, but how do you know it's true?" "Because I can see it," Thomas said simply. "The gospel has shown me what happens if the covenant is broken. I've seen the plague that spreads through the county, the way people waste away and die in agony. I've seen you, Pastor, lying in your bed with your skin turned black and your eyes bleeding. I've seen Mama and Papa buried in the cemetery beside all the others who tried to defy the gospel's will." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. The visions Thomas described were too detailed, too specific to be mere childish imagination. The gospel was showing him possible futures, using his love for his family and community to ensure his cooperation. "Even if that's true," she said desperately, "there might be another way. We could leave Burke County, all of us. We could go somewhere the gospel can't follow." "There is nowhere it can't follow," Thomas replied with absolute certainty. "The gospel exists everywhere and everywhen. It was here before the first human drew breath, and it will be here long after the last star burns out. Running would only delay the inevitable." As if summoned by their conversation, the chapel bell began to toll. But this time, it didn't stop at 13 strikes. It continued ringing, each peal echoing across the swamplands like a summons to judgment. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the ground and the air and the very bones of those who heard it. "It's time," Thomas said, his child's voice filled with anticipation. "The equinox has reached its peak. The gospel is ready to receive its new guardian." Elizabeth made one last desperate attempt. "Thomas, please, just eat one bite of your mother's cooking. For her sake, if not for yours." The boy looked at Martha, and for a moment, his adult composure cracked. She saw her little boy again, the child who had chased fireflies and laughed at silly jokes and begged for one more story at bedtime. "I'm sorry, Mama," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I wish things could be different. I wish I could stay with you and Papa forever. But the gospel needs me, and I can't let everyone else suffer because I was too scared to do what's right." Martha knelt down and pulled her son into her arms, holding him tight as if she could somehow shield him from his destiny through the sheer force of maternal love. "You don't have to do this, baby. We'll find another way. We'll figure something out." "There is no other way," Thomas said gently, patting his mother's back with the wisdom of someone far older than his years. "But it's going to be okay, Mama. The man in black showed me what comes after. It's beautiful. I'll still be me, just more. And I'll be able to protect you and Papa and everyone else in the county." "Isn't that worth a little sacrifice?" The chapel bell continued to toll, and with each strike, the air in the house grew thicker and more oppressive. Elizabeth could feel the gospel's influence pressing against her mind, trying to convince her that resistance was futile, that the boy's sacrifice was not only necessary, but noble. "We have to go down to the chapel now," Thomas said, pulling away from his mother's embrace. "The stranger is waiting, and the gospel doesn't like to be kept waiting." As they made their way toward the stairs that led to the underground chapel, Elizabeth made a silent vow. If she couldn't save Thomas through trickery or persuasion, then she would save him through force. She had the silver crucifix in her pocket, the holy water in her bag. When the moment came, she would fight for the boy's soul with every weapon at her disposal. But as they descended the stone steps, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a trap that had been set long before she was born, by forces that understood human nature far better than she understood theirs. The chapel was filled with figures now, not just the stranger in black, but dozens of spectral forms that Elizabeth recognized as the previous guardians of the gospel. They stood in silent ranks around the altar, their hollow eyes reflecting the blue flames of the candles. At their head stood a figure that could only be Ezekiel Rooke, the first guardian, his face bearing the same features as Silas, but twisted by decades of service to the gospel. "Welcome," the stranger said, his voice carrying across the chamber like the whisper of wind through a graveyard. "We are gathered here tonight to witness the continuation of a covenant that has served both parties well for 50 years. Thomas Rooke, step forward and claim your inheritance." And the boy walked toward the altar with steady steps, showing no fear or hesitation. Elizabeth started to follow, but found her way blocked by the spectral guardians. Their touch was cold as winter frost, and their eyes held a warning that needed no words. "The ritual must proceed without interference," the stranger explained. "The gospel has been patient with your attempts to disrupt its plans, Pastor Whitmore, but its patience is not infinite." "I won't let you harm that child," Elizabeth said, reaching for her crucifix. "Harm him?" The stranger seemed genuinely puzzled. "My dear pastor, we're not going to harm him. We're going to transform him into something greater than he ever could have been as a mere human. Watch and see the glory that awaits those who serve the true God." Thomas climbed onto the altar and lay down upon the cold stone, his small hands folded across his chest like a corpse prepared for burial. The Gospel of Bones lay open beside him, its pages fluttering in a breeze that touched nothing else in the chamber. "Thomas Rooke," the stranger intoned, "do you willingly accept the role of guardian? Do you freely choose to serve the gospel and all it represents?" "I do," Thomas replied, his voice clear and strong. Do you understand that this choice will change you forever, that you will no longer be entirely human? I do. And do you make this choice of your own free will without coercion or deception? Elizabeth held her breath, praying that the boy would hesitate, would show some sign of doubt that might invalidate the ritual. I do, Thomas said firmly. The stranger smiled and picked up a ceremonial knife from the altar. Its blade was black as midnight and seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. Then let the covenant be renewed in blood and sealed in flesh. As the knife descended toward Thomas's outstretched wrist, Elizabeth broke free from the spectral guardians and lunged forward, the silver crucifix blazing in her hand like a star. In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to stop. The stranger paused, the knife hovering inches from Thomas's skin. For a moment, the chamber was filled with a silence so profound that Elizabeth could hear her own heartbeat. Then the stranger began to laugh. "Oh, my dear pastor," he said, his voice filled with genuine amusement. "Did you really think it would be that simple? Did you really believe that a piece of silver and a few words would be enough to break a covenant written in the very fabric of reality?" The crucifix in Elizabeth's hand began to grow hot, then burning hot, until she was forced to drop it. The silver cross hit the stone floor and immediately began to tarnish, turning black as if exposed to some corrosive force. "Your God has no power here," the stranger continued. "This place exists outside his jurisdiction, in the spaces between faith and doubt, between hope and despair. Here, older laws apply." "No," Elizabeth said desperately. "God's love is stronger than any darkness. His mercy can break any chain." "Can it?" The stranger gestured toward the gospel, and its pages began to turn of their own accord. "Then explain this." Elizabeth found herself looking at a page that showed the crucifixion, but not as she had ever seen it depicted before. In this version, Christ hung on the cross not in noble suffering, but in screaming agony, his face twisted with pain and despair. And standing at the foot of the cross, watching with satisfaction, was a figure that looked remarkably like the stranger.